What is up, people? Today we'll be looking at my personal top 15 best Game Boy Ninja games. Why? Because ninjas are cool and there used to be a lot of ninja games. The number of ninja games has certainly decreased in recent years, although my love of them has not. In fact, whenever I'd make games of my own, or at least try to, I'd always default to making it a ninja game. As for what meets the criteria of this video, literally just anything where you play as a ninja. Number 15, Ninja Taro. This game is a part of the Yancha-Maru series. This dude has a ton of games. I even recently bought one of his collections that came to Switch. But this is also the secret third game in the Roland's Curse trilogy, and like those, this is a top-down adventure game with light RPG elements, with items you can use, towns with NPCs you can talk to, although it's not a true RPG as there's no experience points. I really like the tunes in this game. It goes without saying every ninja game needs good tunes. But by far the weakest aspect of this game is how slow this dude is. He's supposed to be a ninja, he's not even close to this slow in his other games. How can this be possible? You also have limited control over him as you can move only in 4 directions, so things can be pretty damn hard to dodge because of that, especially because enemies are much faster than you. Overall, this makes the design and combat more shallow, especially when compared to something like Link's Awakening. Moving in 4 directions still works well for something like Zelda 1, due to the level of precision and speed of the character, but Yancha-Maru here, yeah, no. But probably the worst aspect of this game is the backtracking, which turns this into easily the longest game of the Roland's Curse trilogy. There's backtracking just for the sake of it to pad out length. As an example, one time I interacted with a wall and a question mark popped up, then I had to backtrack all the way back somewhere to speak with someone, then all the way back to the wall to progress. This kind of thing can already be cryptic to figure out, but they really couldn't have made this dude just a little bit faster if they're gonna have you going back and forth all the time. But yeah, since Yancha-Maru is incapable of actually dodging anything, you basically have to tank hits. My tip to make this game easier for you is to find an enemy that drops a potion, and continue farming that guy until you get the maximum potions you can carry, which if I remember is 15. Given this game's scope, it was a pretty ambitious title, but it's hard to recommend this game. However, they would rectify many of the mistakes of this game in the next installment, Roland's Curse 2, which is a game I can pretty confidently recommend. It's a game with 7 playable characters, unfortunately none of them are ninjas though. Number 14, TMNT 3 Radical Rescue. So this is a game I already talked about in my ranking every game in the Kawabunga collection video, and I'm not really sure how much I want to repeat myself, but basically this game is pretty notable for being an early Game Boy Metroidvania, as well as a Konami Metroidvania that predates Symphony of the Night. Another ambitious game, but this is not really my cup of tea for how I want a TMNT game to play. To be honest, at this point I'm pretty tired of how many 2D action games released nowadays that seemingly have to be Metroidvanias, but yeah, I just didn't find exploring this game to be all too interesting. But the thing is, no exaggeration, over 70% of my total playtime with this game was actually spent in the absolutely brutal boss rush at the end. So at that point, was this really a Metroidvania, or in actuality, a boss rush game? I've actually seen someone else spend like 10 hours on this boss rush, so it's not just me. This is probably something you'll be able to overlook if you use save states or whatever, but I never do that, and as a result, this just really pissed me off. It wouldn't be so bad if these guys didn't have so much invincibility, or if you could hit them for more than 1 damage at a time. This game is much harder than TMNT 1 on NES in my opinion, which everyone likes to complain is the hardest video game of all time. Number 13, Maru's Mission. Another game in the Yancha-Maru series, and interestingly enough, this game recently received a Game Boy Color version, Ninja Yancha-Maru The Great World Adventure, which you can play if you have the collection I mentioned earlier, or you can get the cartridge, which I wouldn't say is worth it. This color version is based off the Japanese version, and there's some key differences, like the final boss in that version being Satan. First time I went through this game I thought it was actually quite decent, but after repeat playthroughs I'm not so impressed. This game is not very polished, so they give you a ton of health to make up for the careless enemy placements, since you're basically going through and tanking hits. Even more so than Ninja Taro. So yeah, this game is not very rewarding to return to. I mean, how do you actually expect people to dodge some of this stuff? The unskippable cutscenes are also pretty boring on these repeat playthroughs. They should have taken some notes from Ninja Gaiden. First time I played this game I didn't even know what happens if you die, since I couldn't die. But when I went through the GBC version I did learn, as I immediately fell to my death after a cutscene ended. And yeah, it just sends you back to the title screen. So yeah, apparently I did a no death playthrough on my first try. Some are sure to enjoy this game, I know I did my first time through, and it's also recommendable for people who want a short and easy game. But after multiple playthroughs, my opinion of this one has lowered. Number 12, Ninja Boy 2. Ninja Boy 1 has been left off this list because it's really not very good, even when compared to the NES counterpart Kung Fu Heroes, which I would much rather play. I've even seen people claim that Ninja Boy 1 is the worst Game Boy game. Ninja Boy 2 is actually a much different game, and is an action RPG kinda like Zelda 2, except not nearly as good. You don't get to play any levels in this perspective. It's just top-down dungeons like any RPG, and unlike Zelda 2 where stats cap rather quickly, I ended this game at level 35. The random encounters play kind of like a beat 'em up, but they're not very interesting and become repetitive very quickly. Do we really have to turn a beat 'em up into an RPG? I would much rather just play a regular beat 'em up. When it comes to RPG like beat 'em ups though, River City Ransom did it much better. You might think that you might not have to grind in this game, because you can just perform well in the beat 'em up sections, but actually this game becomes turn-based during the boss fights, so you might actually want to make sure your character is sufficiently leveled. But honestly, the overworld in this game is pretty unique and kind of fun to explore in comparison to most RPGs, and for that reason, this ended up being one of the more enjoyable RPGs on Game Boy for me. There are two very similar ninja games, Nintama Taro GB, an anime licensed game by the same developer, and Super Chinese Land 3, the sequel to Ninja Boy 2. Yeah, these guys aren't actually ninjas, they were only localized to be, but that's enough to meet the criteria for this list. I wouldn't be surprised if those two games are better than Ninja Boy 2, since they came out after. I'm just not going to go through the effort of playing those mainly since they're untranslated, and I'm not a super fan of this game. Number 11, Ganbare Goemon, Sarawareta Ebisumaru. This was a Japan-only game until they translated it into Konami GB Collection Volume 3, which is how I played this game, and it's the first Goemon game on the system. I really like the overall presentation, especially the music. At first it seemed like a pretty chill game with a fun world to explore, not that it offers the same amount of freedom as Zelda or anything. The game is quite linear, and it's a heck of a lot better than Keisuya Nagoya's attempt at a Game Boy Goemon game that came out 6 years later. That game really has nothing going on in the levels, you don't even have to engage with the enemies really. It also has a much worse soundtrack, and the only challenge comes from the absolute BS boss fight mini-games that make you instantly game over. The first one requiring that you be in the top 0.1% of masters worldwide to progress. Like, what the heck? Did they want people to break their Game Boys playing this or something? So yeah, that Goemon game will not be making an appearance on this list. But I have to be honest, when it comes to Sarawareta Ebisumaru, it also has the same problem as the other Konami Ninja game to appear, TMNT 3, which is that when I think of this game, I think of one part, which is the platforming portion where you play as Miko. You have to search every stone to find 4 randomly placed pearls. Like, getting through the platforming is hard enough, but you also need to find these pearls, really? It even requires you to backtrack through this entire platforming section after you give all the pearls to the Lord of the Sea, when it was already really long just going one way. This is one of the most absurd difficulty spikes I've encountered in a game, as everything before and after this is a cakewalk. Platforming is absolutely not a strength of this game, so I don't know why there's so much emphasis on it in this section. You fall into the water and you instantly die. There's disappearing platforms and enemies that are trying to kill you while you're doing all this. Some of these jumps just feel misleading and it's hard to line up with stuff. Compared to the platforming in the Famicom games, which is so simple and doesn't force you to jump diagonally onto single tiles. I didn't think ninjas were supposed to be this vulnerable to water. Again, this is a part of the game people who use save states can probably overlook, but I don't do that, and as a result, kinda lost my mind in the process. To be honest, this section ruined what would have been an otherwise pretty good and recommendable game. No exaggeration, this is probably where 70% of my total playtime took place. Number 10, Joe and Mac, also known as Joe and Mac Caveman Ninja in Europe. So we have some overlap between caveman games and ninja games here. If you didn't know, I also intend to do a top 10 caveman platformers on the Game Boy video, which is another cool theme that was prominently done in the past, but unlike ninjas, I don't really see caveman games get made nowadays. These guys being part ninjas definitely gives them some cooler abilities than caveman you'll see in other platformers, and my biggest praise for this game is that it remains the only version of Joe and Mac I've actually finished. It sure seemed a lot better than the NES game, but I really have no excuse for not finishing the Super Nintendo version, I just haven't yet. I would not try to claim that this is superior to that version. My biggest problem with this version is that it can be hard to tell what I'm even looking at sometimes. First time I played this, I didn't know this part had water you need to not fall into, since it looks so similar to the ground, so there can definitely be some frustrating deaths here in a game with no continues. There's also inconsistent difficulty with some levels being cakewalks, including the final one, that you might be able to beat on your first try, while other levels have things like lightning strikes out of nowhere that you're certainly not going to see coming your first time through. There's also some RNG at hand here when it comes to what the enemies feel like dropping for you, and I feel like I should probably mention that 50% of this game consists of fighting bosses that, while being cool prehistoric creatures, aren't terribly interesting to actually fight. If this game had a bit more care put into it, it'd be something I could recommend, but you should be warned a bit before going into this one, as every game after this in the video are all solid in my view. And the first of these solid games is Saigo no Nindou Ninja Spirit. Originally an arcade game with many versions just like Joe and Mac, but I must confess this remains the only version of this game I've played so far. From what I've heard, a lot of these versions offer quite a challenge, but as for this Game Boy version, it's probably going to end up being on my short and easy Game Boy games you should play video later down the line. This version seems to have simplified things, but obviously I found this to be quite fun, with all these different ninja abilities at your disposal, like being able to walk upside down and the iconic shadow clones, which I'm fairly certain inspired those found in Ninja Gaiden 2, which I think is one of the coolest and most fun abilities in any video game. This version might not please fans of the arcade or turbo graphics versions, but I think for those craving for a fun Game Boy game to spend 20 to 30 minutes blasting through, you can do a whole lot worse than Ninja Spirit. Number 8, Zen Intergalactic Ninja. So here we have a game by Konami based off a comic character I know nothing about, and Konami surely didn't know either. I mean, this game wasn't even released in Japan, but that type of thing didn't stop Konami back in the day from making an awesome video game. They seem to release this Game Boy version at the same time as the NES game, but don't get it twisted, these are not very similar. The NES version combines many different gameplay types, even having an isometric perspective at times, while the Game Boy version is strictly a side-scrolling action platform game, which normally I would prefer, and this title is very solidly designed. I really have no problems with the design itself, but unfortunately this game suffers the same problem as many other Konami Game Boy titles, which is that it features a lot of slowdown. Seemingly because it contains very nice and large detailed sprites, Konami like to make their Game Boy games look good, which unfortunately would often come at the cost of playability, and it's mostly for that reason I prefer the NES game, which does contain some design choices I don't care for, but it just plays at a much more acceptable speed. Both these games contain anti-pollution messages. I guess the point of this superhero is that he tries to save the world from pollution, and both games feature stage select, which is pretty cool. The NES levels certainly offer a greater challenge, and that game also has limited continues. While this Game Boy version is pretty smooth sailing, I don't think you're gonna have a hard time beating this one. But yeah, not only one of the best ninja games on the system, but also one of the best superhero games you'll find on Game Boy. There's not many good ones. Number 7, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan. Here we have another Konami game based on a comic that I'm sure they didn't know too much about. And like Zen, it's another game that has very detailed sprites that results in slowdown. Yeah, once again, that's the biggest problem with this title. And like Ninja Spirit, this is another game that's definitely going to end up on my short and easy Game Boy games you should play video. And like TMNT 3, this is another game I've already talked about in my first video I uploaded on this channel, so I'll try to keep it short. This was one of the best looking Game Boy games at the time of its release. Yeah, it's slow, but they got enemies jumping in on you constantly to keep you on your toes, although because they don't do too much damage and you can heal rather easily, they don't end up being much of a problem. Unfortunately, the 4 turtles in this game don't play any different from each other, and yeah, it's a whole lot more simple than TMNT 3 overall, and that game definitely handles better, but this is more my cup of tea and definitely a great title to bust out if you're looking to kill 30 minutes. Number 6, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Back from the Sewers. Yeah, there are a lot of Konami games on this list, and in my opinion this is easily the best TMNT Game Boy game. It might also be the ugliest graphically. I mean, the turtles look pretty awkward here, but despite that, this has the largest file size of the TMNT trilogy. It's almost as large as TMNT 1 and 3 combined. Now why is that? Is this just the longest one? Well no, Radical Rescue is certainly the longer game. I'm pretty sure the reason why this is so large is because it features very high quality digitized speech when you pause the game. Time. Would you believe that that's on the original Game Boy? But the game itself is at the perfect length in my opinion, and offers a lot of gameplay variety. Some sections play like a beat 'em up and others play like an action platform game. Though I don't really think the platforming itself was done all too well, since you'll often not be able to see what's above or below you. And the turtles once again don't play any differently from each other here, which is always disappointing. But overall a very satisfactory Turtles game in my opinion, and honestly one of the most unique. Number 5, Ganso Yancha-Maru. You might know this guy better as Kid Niki, which is what he was localized as for his NES game. It's an Irem franchise, but this game here wasn't developed by Irem, but instead Tamtex, who developed some quote-unquote hidden gems, like Metal Storm and Spartan X2, which didn't make it outside of Japan. And for whatever reason, Ganso Yancha-Maru didn't make it outside of Japan either, and neither did his second or third adventures on the Famicom. Considering Kid Niki made its way on the Commodore 64 and Apple II, I assume this would have been decently popular in the West, so it's a real shame because this game is indeed a gem. This is just a good old classic video game that's about the same length as Super Mario Land, although offers a greater challenge with overall more difficult platforming and hidden tanukis in these blocks you destroy that'll try to kill you. You need to be careful as you do die in just one hit, which makes the boss fights a bit scary, but going through and using Yancha-Maru's spinning sword is quite fun. The goal is to save Kurumi Hime, or I guess Princess Walnut, who apparently shares the same name as the ninja from Sega Ninja, also known as Ninja Princess. Is this related to that? I don't know man, someone please let me know. Number 4, Super Chinese Fighter. Would you believe it? The Ninja Boy franchise is back on this list. Well actually it's a part of the Super Chinese series, and because this is another game that didn't make its way outside of Japan, there are actually no ninjas in this game. They're just kung fu practitioners, but for the sake of consistency it's gotta be included here if Ninja Boy 2 is on this list, as they're still part of the same series. Although there is actually a ninja fighting game on Game Boy developed by Tosei called Ninku, based off the anime and manga series. Nindou is actually my 16th favorite ninja game on the Game Boy, but unfortunately this is a top 15, so I'm sorry if that disappoints all the Nindou fans who are anticipating its appearance. Unlike that game though, Super Chinese Fighter is actually a solid fighting game with a surprising amount of playable characters. I just like to play as Lin though, but the other characters clearly play quite differently. The presentation is nice and the combos are satisfying to land. While I seem to usually not care much for Culture Brain games, they did not disappoint when it came to fighting games, as they also released the SD Hiryu no Ken Gaiden games on the Game Boy, which are very similar to Super Chinese Fighter. I should mention this game does have a Game Boy Color version, Super Chinese Fighter EX. Normally I'd put the color version over the original game, but despite being playable only on color, the color job doesn't actually look very good in my opinion. It often looks pretty ugly with way too much white. Oh well, they're pretty much the same game though, so it doesn't really matter what you go for, but it's pretty shocking that the color version is somehow not playable on the original Game Boy. Number 3, Mercenary Force. Now, did you expect a shmup to show up? Well, it's likely that you didn't, because I'm sure that many of you do not consider Mercenary Force to be a ninja game, as there are 5 different mercenaries you can hire to be one of your 4 party members. However, the only way I can beat this game is if I hire exclusively ninjas, and I'm not joking. So if I'm playing through the entire game as 4 ninjas, I'm most definitely considering it to be a ninja game. But this is not really the recommended way to play the game, and you are at no point required to play as any ninjas. I like these guys because they're quite simple and shoot forward, so I can just focus on dodging. But this is really a one-of-a-kind game for the system, there's nothing else like it. You go through and you kill yokai. If one of your party members die, you can hire a new servant to take their place, so you gotta be pretty careful about your spending. But if you're good enough, you can also just clear the whole game with one dude. There are some strange power-ups as well, but using it will sacrifice one of your members. So if one of your members is low in health, it's smart to use one, as it's basically a screen clearing attack where you're invincible. You can change the formation of your party to choose who to sacrifice. Very fun and unique game, and Nintendo themselves took a liking to it as they went on to publish it in Europe. And just keep in mind this came from a time when they were publishing quality Game Boy titles, before they started getting weird with the Game Boy Color. This is unfortunately the only action game made by this developer on the system, which is a huge shame, as the other games they created on the system were Knight's Quest, a really boring RPG, and Battle of Kingdom, a boring strategy board game. Clearly they were capable of making very interesting action titles, so this is a real shame. And here we have a game that was very close to number 1 on this list, Ganbare Goemon Seikuushi Dynamites Arawaru, a Goemon game that is actually really good, and it's shocking there's no English translation for this, as well as the 2 Goemon Game Boy Color RPGs I've never played. This here though is a good side-scroller with Goemon elements, which is probably why I like it so much. It's also, dare I say, one of the best looking Game Boy Color games. It's very charming just to walk through this game's towns. So I think the Goemon elements and the platforming levels were very well done, but where this game doesn't quite hit the mark is in some of its attempts to add gameplay variety, such as these shmup sections that are extremely boring, slow, easy, and have nothing going on, which especially hurts the game's replayability. It even makes other platformers' attempts at throwing in a shmup section seem very exhilarating in comparison. So these are really unfortunate inclusions in an otherwise thoroughly enjoyable game. And number 1 is actually not a Konami game, but is in fact a Natsume game, Ninja Gaiden Shadow. This was one of the first Game Boy games I played, and while I thought it was good back then, I still thought it was a downgrade from the NES games due to its much slower speed and removing Ryu's wall jumping capabilities. But after becoming a bit more open-minded by playing other Ninja Gaiden games like the ones on Sega, which play a bit differently, and also because I've since beaten each of the NES games without dying, I figured I should give this a revisit, and I'm very glad I did, as this was originally number 2 on this list, but I swiftly changed my mind. This is an expertly crafted game with excellent design language by pros over at Natsume, who just before this also worked on Shadow of the Ninja for NES. This was originally supposed to be an adaptation of that game. In the end though, it ended up combining elements from Ninja Gaiden 3 and Shadow of the Ninja, which can be seen as you're able to hang on from things, and you also got this grappling hook this time around. I would much rather have wall jumps over it though, but this is definitely a Ninja Gaiden game. There's skill that would transfer over if you've mastered the NES games, as it took only 2 attempts to do a no-death playthrough. The same amount it took me to do the Famicom version of Ninja Gaiden 3, so I say the difficulty is comparable to that game, which is to say, pretty dang easy as far as Ninja Gaiden goes. But damn if it ain't fun. And I've always thought this was probably the single greatest soundtrack on the Game Boy, taking some of the best tunes from the Ninja Gaiden trilogy, but adding great new tunes as well. This game has now become one of my top 10 on the system. I should mention that Natsume also published a spiritual successor to Shadow of the Ninja on Game Boy Color in 2001, Return of the Ninja, but it's not actually developed by Natsume, but instead Act Japan, and it really shows and doesn't play anything like Shadow of the Ninja. Actually, I don't like this game very much. The ninjas don't feel good to control, the levels aren't fun, they unfortunately put a lot of emphasis on stealth elements, which just makes the game boring to me. You might have thought this would be on here because I showed it at the beginning, but haha! I tricked you. But 3 legends at Natsume who worked on Ninja Gaiden Shadow ended up remaking Shadow of the Ninja, which released in 2024 as Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, and it's one of the best games I've played all year. These guys were experts 35 years ago, and they're still kicking ass today and actually gave me a reason to buy and play a modern video game. So that's going to be it for this video. Next one will be top 10 caveman platformers on the Game Boy, another topic no one cares about.